Hi there. Welcome back to Letting Go Like Jesus, a YouTube retreat. Our theme for this video, it's part one of Sink into the Nothingness. We're going to look at letting go with this very particular phrase from 14th century German mysticism. And the phrase is, sink into nothingness. It's a phrase I think that will help us see a different side of letting go and maybe even wake us up with its seemingly harsh language to the radical nature of letting go. But first, we begin with our story. And today's story is the epic fantasy adventure, The Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because it's a very long story, but let me briefly summarize it. It's about a hobbit, a small creature about the size of a child, named Frodo. And Frodo has the task of taking the Ring of Power, a weapon forged by an evil being named Sauron. Excuse me. Frodo has the task of taking the Ring of Power to Mount Doom to destroy it. Now, Frodo is a hobbit, and he does this task along with a wizard named Gandalf, and with elves and dwarves and men and warriors of great strength. Each one of them is susceptible to the corrupting power of the ring. The ring makes whoever wears it into something evil. But Frodo, a hobbit, a small creature who is from a race of beings who don't care to be in the spotlight, who don't care for great power, who are just content with ordinary life. It's Frodo who shows the most resistance to this corrupting influence of the ring. And so it's Frodo who is able eventually to destroy the ring. He bears his burden and he casts it into the fires of Mount Doom and saves the fictional world of Middle-earth. Frodo, along with the other hobbits in the Lord of the Rings series, he represents littleness, ordinariness, being nobody. Compared to the wizards and the warriors, the elves and the dwarves of Middle-earth, Frodo and the other hobbits are nothing. And so they're great examples of what Jesus talks about in our first formula today. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the New Testament was written in Greek. The word poor in Greek is ptochos. And it doesn't mean someone who's below the poverty line, as we measure it here in the United States. Rather, ptochos means someone who is suffering from absolute destitution. Further, this is someone whom the first century world, Jesus' culture, considered to be worthless. These are the people who count for nothing. Now, Jesus is saying it's those people who spiritually are blessed, are happy. Spiritual poverty is this state of interior nothingness. So we might rewrite this beatitude to say, happiness is the state of interior nothingness. And when we're in that state, we know we're one with God. So I think it's pretty clear here that Jesus teaches a practice and a path of nothingness. An interior nothingness. That is, an interior state in which we're detached from our thoughts and our feelings, from all the content of our minds. And even more, God chooses this way of nothingness in the grand schema of salvation. God becomes a human being in Jesus and dies on a cross. God chooses to empty the divine self by becoming human, and even more so by dying on a cross. God enacts nothingness in the story, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And that leads us into our second formula. It's this teaching of nothingness is not just in Jesus, it's also in St. Paul. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says, God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something. What does this mean here? Those who are something. We maybe know, we sometimes say colloquially, we think we're something, or you think you're something. Meaning you think you're really bigger than you are, or you're getting really egotistical. That's what that word something means in this context. It represents our unbridled narcissism, our pride, our feigned superiority, our egocentricity. Most of all, it represents our self-referential thinking. Almost everything that we think about and that we feel and that we do and that we talk about, we refer back to the self, to the ego. And so that word something represents our self-referential thinking, our entitlement, our feigned superiority, basically thinking we're better than everyone else because maybe we're attractive or smart or we have something special about us, maybe a gift that we think sets us apart from others and makes us distinct. It's this kind of thinking that creates and maintains the illusion of being separate from God. Most of all, the thought of self-reflection, keeps that illusion going. That illusion that we're disconnected from God, that we're so distinct from God that we're not at all connected to the divine reality. So God's plan is to reduce that something, all that self-referential thinking, to nothing. And it's not to just teach us a lesson in humility. It's not to just squash our pride that God is choosing to do this. God wants to reduce us to nothing so that we realize we're one with the nothing. Many mystics call God nothing, no thing, beyond all being. Of course, they believe God is real, utterly real. But they also believe God is nothing, because God's not a thing, and God transcends all existence. And so God wants to reduce us to nothing, so we realize we are nothing. We are one with God. It's hard for us to get past this word nothing, perhaps, because it's such a terrifying word. It's maybe the ultimate negative word. And many of us think when we die, that's it, there's nothing. And so it might represent that primal fear of death. But James Finley, a spiritual author, a current spiritual author, who was at one time a Trappist monk and taught by Thomas Merton, he says, the nothingness we fear is in fact the treasure we long for, because God is our treasure. And once we start letting go of ourselves, we discover that treasure through nothingness. Now, this is confirmed in Jesus' life. He's reduced to nothingness, of course, on the cross, but he's also reduced to nothingness when he's in the desert. And Luke's gospel says that when Jesus was in the desert, he ate nothing. Now, literally, yes, he fasted, but we could also interpret that spiritually. Jesus fed on the nothingness of God. Jesus walked the path of letting go. Of course, the desert is also a great biblical symbol for God's utter mystery, for God's nothingness. So that leads us to our third formula, and it comes to us from the great example of 14th century German mysticism, Meister Eckhart. And he says in his 83rd sermon, sink down out of something into nothing. Now, of course, he names our theme for this video and our next video. But earlier in this sermon, this 83rd sermon of Meister Eckhart, he says this, sink down out of all yourness and flow into God's godness. And then you will know God's uncreated self-identity and the divine nameless nothingness. Eckhart is saying to sink down out of all that all that makes you, you. Or in other words, your ego. This thought of self that we're talking about. This somethingness that represents our pride, our narcissism, our egocentricity. And that's creates and maintains the illusion that we're separate from God. But let's focus on that word sink for a moment. Imagine sinking to the bottom of a pool. When we do that, we're just letting the air out of our lungs and we're not really doing anything, we're just letting go of air. And as we let go, we sink further and further to the bottom. But when we try and sink, when we flail our arms, when we try and swim, we prevent ourselves from sinking. That word sink represents effortlessness. how letting go doesn't mean we do anything necessarily. It's more of a dropping. It's more of an effortless release into God. And God, as Eckhart is often fond of saying, God is nothing. So we're releasing ourselves into God. When Eckhart says, sink down out of something into nothing, he's saying, let go of who you think you are. Let go of your self-identity, this thought of ego, this self-reflection, and identify with the indistinct nothingness of God. Nothingness is indistinct. It's not anything in particular. It's not something particular. Our problem is we want to be something particular. We want to be special. We want to stand out. We want to be set off from the crowd so that we can get everybody's applause, so that we can have power, so we can have all of our security needs met. It's pure ego. Eckhart is saying, don't even play that game. Don't even go there. Instead, sink into God's indistinct nothingness. In other words, the nothingness is one with all things. In God, we're one with all people, with all creation. So when we're sunk in nothingness, we're one with God. When we're sunk in nothingness, we refuse to talk to ourselves. We don't look at ourselves. We don't look at our thoughts. We don't feed our egocentricity with thoughts and feelings. We abide in a state of interior silence, interior solitude, detachment, what we're calling here nothingness. And so our spiritual practice of letting go is quite simple. We let go by sinking into nothingness. Whenever we get upset, whenever we fail or we react to something or we're clinging to something, in other words, whenever an attachment appears and we notice it, sink into nothing. Whenever we think, sink into the nothingness of God. So let's review. Here are our three formulas. First, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Second, St. Paul says, God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something. And third, Meister Eckhart says, sink down out of something into nothing. And our major points are, first, Jesus teaches a path of nothingness. Second, the word something represents our unbridled narcissism, the thought of self. And third, to let go is to sink into nothingness. So our spiritual practice, again, is simple. We let go by sinking into nothingness. We abide in a state of interior silence, of detachment from our thinking. We let go of self and flow into God. We sink into the nothingness of God. Whenever we think of anything, whenever we get upset, whenever anything happens, sink into the nothingness of God. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I look forward to our next video, part 2, on sinking into nothingness. Please like this video. Please comment below. Please share it with friends and family. And otherwise, as always, God bless.